She stood on the observation deck of the flagship ossuary of kings, looking down at the blue and white curve of a planet called Earth, and she could not shake the feeling that she had been handed something rather than taken it. 6 weeks. That was how long the campaign had lasted, from the first probing strike against the orbital shipyards to the final human envoy kneeling in the docking bay of this very ship, offering terms so generous to the Dominion that Vashtor's own treasurer had asked, twice, whether the translation software was malfunctioning. No other species surrendered like this. The Threll had fought to the last burrow. The Okadi had detonated their own home moon rather than let it fall. Even the placid, slow-blooded Vern had made her pay for every reef they held. Humans had looked at the Dominion's fleet, calculated the odds, and folded fast, clean, almost courteous. It should have felt like triumph. Instead it itched at the back of her skull like a splinter she couldn't locate. "You're troubled, my queen." General Threx approached from behind, his 4 eyes doing their habitual sweep of the room before settling on her. He was old enough to remember when the Dominion had needed to fight for every acre of ground it held, and young enough still to resent that those days were over. "This is what a good war looks like. Quick, cheap, few of ours in the ground." "That is exactly what troubles me," Vashtor said. "I have fought 7 campaigns, Threx. I have never had one end this way. Not because they lacked the will to resist. Their weapons were sound, their defenses well designed. They had the capacity to make this expensive for us. They chose not to spend it." Threx made a dismissive click with his mandibles, a sound she had come to recognize as the particular arrogance of a soldier who had already decided a battle was over. "Perhaps they are simply a soft species who understood the futility of resistance. Not every world is built for war, my queen. Enjoy the gift." Vashtor said nothing, but she made a note in the private ledger she kept in her own head that Threx's confidence was a data point too, and not a reassuring one. The order she gave that evening was routine on its surface. Every newly annexed world underwent what the Dominion called a compliance profile, a systematic digestion of the conquered species' own records, their laws, their conflicts, their patterns of obedience and defiance, compiled by ministry analysts into something a governor could use to keep the peace without wasting resources on unnecessary garrisons. It was standard occupation procedure. She had ordered it on 10 worlds before this one. What was not routine was how fast the analysts came back to her, and how they looked when they did. Minister Urel Casa, head of the Ministry of Occupied Records, was not a woman given to visible unease. She had catalogued the death songs of the Okadi without flinching. She had sat through the Threll's ritual accounts of siege cannibalism during the Burrow Wars and taken notes in a steady hand. When she requested an audience with the Queen 11 days into the Earth occupation, for days ahead of the scheduled briefing, Vashtor granted it immediately, because Casa did not ask for things ahead of schedule. "Your Majesty," Casa said, and set a data slate on the table between them with the particular care of someone setting down something that might go off. "We have a problem with the archive." "Corrupted records?" "No, the opposite. There's too much of it, and it doesn't say what the surrender implied it would say." Vashtor waited. "We began, as standard, with their most recent conflicts, internal wars, regional disputes, the sort of thing that tells us how a population behaves under stress. And then we went further back because the analysts wanted context." Cass's 4 fingers drummed once against the slate's edge, a habit Vashtor had never seen her indulge before. "Your Majesty, this species has fought itself and outside threats, without meaningful pause for the entirety of its recorded history. Not skirmishes. Wars that lasted the length of Dominion campaigns twice over. Wars fought with tools so primitive it should have been physically impossible to sustain them for as long as they did. And they sustained them anyway, generation after generation, because someone always decided the cost was still worth paying. Every species has old wars in its past, Minister. That is not remarkable. It's not the wars that are remarkable. It's the pattern in how they end." Casa tapped the slate, and a projection bloomed above it. Grainy recovered footage, translated text scrolling beside it, fragments of what looked like archival newsreels. "In 9 wars out of 10 this species fought, the side with fewer resources did not surrender when a rational actor would have. They kept fighting past the point of any calculable benefit. Entire populations submitted to famine, to occupation, to bombardment that leveled their cities to rubble, and instead of yielding they simply changed the shape of the fight, went underground, went quiet, waited. Vashtor looked at the footage without really seeing it. You're telling me this is a species that does not know how to surrender. I'm telling you this is a species that surrenders constantly, on paper, and rarely means it. Cass's voice had gone very careful. The tone of someone delivering news she suspected the listener did not want. Your Majesty, I would like to request more time and more analysts before the ministry files its compliance profile. What we have is not enough to advise you on how to hold this world. It may be enough to advise you that 6 weeks was not a victory. It may have been a down payment. Vashtor did not sleep well that night, which was, in itself, unusual enough to notice. She told herself it was the strangeness of a new world's gravity, the low hum of an unfamiliar star through the hull, anything but the sentence Cassa had left hanging in the room. It may have been a down payment. She had turned it over so many times by the ship's 3rd hour of night cycle that she finally gave up on sleep entirely and did something she rarely did as queen. She went to look at the raw material herself, instead of waiting for it to be interpreted for her. The ministry's archive access terminal was housed 3 decks below her private quarters, in a room usually staffed around the clock by junior analysts who went very still and very quiet when their monarch walked in unannounced at the deep end of night cycle. She dismissed them with a gesture and sat down alone at the console, and asked it plainly to show her what a human called a world war. Took 4 hours. She did not notice the time passing. She read reports from soldiers who described, in flat, unemotional language, walking toward gun emplacements they knew would kill most of them, because the alternative retreat, surrender, seeding ground had been judged worse. She found records of a besieged city that ate its pets, then its leather, then began starving in earnest, and never opened its gates. She found the after-action reports of what humans called partisans, not soldiers, farmers and clerks and schoolteachers, fighting an occupying army with stolen rifles and homemade explosives, for years, long after their own government had formally capitulated and told them to stop. What struck her most was not the violence. Violence was familiar. The Dominion had its own long ledger of it. What struck her was the arithmetic, or rather, the total absence of arithmetic where she expected to find it. Every species she had ever conquered had a point at which continued resistance stopped making sense and the losing side did the sensible thing. Humans had that point too, on paper, written into their treaties and their surrender documents in careful, formal language. They simply didn't always honor it. And the ones who kept fighting past that point were not always the soldiers. Sometimes they were the people the soldiers had left behind. She found something else, too, buried in a set of records the ministry analysts had flagged as low priority. The negotiation transcripts from Earth's own surrender to the Dominion 6 weeks ago. She had read a summary of these already. She had not read the full text. Reading it now, slowly, she noticed something she had missed in the summary, a line from the lead human negotiator, almost thrown away in the middle of a paragraph about resource allocation and administrative continuity, that the ministry's translation software had rendered, a little clumsily, as "We are not interested in losing a war we have already priced." At the time it had read as boilerplate. Now it read like something else entirely. Not a surrender, a calculation, a decision that this particular fight at this particular moment against this particular fleet was not the one worth having yet. Vashtor sat in the empty archive room until the ship's lights began their slow simulated dawn, and thought about the difference between a species that could not fight and a species that had simply decided not to, this time on these terms, and was quietly waiting to see whether the terms would change. She called a war council the next morning, which surprised everyone, because as far as the court knew, the war was over. "I want every garrison commander to report their current posture," she told the assembled officers. "And I want it doubled. Not because I expect an uprising tomorrow. Because I have read what this species does when it decides a fight is worth its full attention, and I intend for us to notice the moment before it decides that, not after." Threx predictably objected. "My queen, with respect, doubling garrison strength on a pacified world sends a message. It tells the humans we don't trust the peace we ourselves negotiated. It could provoke the very unrest you're trying to prevent. They are not going to be provoked by caution, General. I have spent a night reading what happens when this species is provoked by carelessness. She let that sit. Minister Cass's team will have full ministry resources for as long as they need them. I want to know every insurgency this species has ever run against an occupying power, how it started, how it was organized, and how long it took the occupier to notice it was happening. I want that comparison drawn before I authorize a single further troop withdrawal. It was not the response the room expected from a queen who had just won, by every visible measure, an unusually cheap and easy war. Several of her officers exchanged the kind of look that meant they thought she was being overly cautious with a beaten species. She let them think it. Caution that turned out to be unnecessary cost nothing. Confidence that turned out to be misplaced had a much steeper price, and she had just spent a night reading, in exhaustive and uncomfortable detail, exactly how steep. The first report came in 9 days later, from a Cothres supply depot on the edge of what humans called the Midwest continental region. It was small. That was what made it worrying. A shipment of refined or routine and unremarkable had gone missing between the rail terminal and the depot. Not stolen in any way that triggered an alarm, not seized at gunpoint, simply rerouted through a set of falsified manifest codes that took the depot's own logistics officer 6 hours to notice were wrong at all. When the ministry's investigators traced the falsified codes back, they found they'd been generated using an old human rail dispatch protocol, decades out of use, that should have been completely unfamiliar to anyone born after the system was decommissioned. Someone had gone looking for it. Someone had found a piece of their own history, a method their grandparents might have used against a different occupier in a different war. On paper, the ministry itself had scanned and translated and filed as historical curiosity, and quietly put it back into service. Cassa brought the report to Vashtor personally, this time without being summoned. "It's not sabotage exactly," Cassa said. "Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was even taken, as far as we can tell. The ore was rerouted to a secondary depot, still under our control, just not the one it was meant for. If I didn't know what I was looking at, I'd call it a clerical error. But you do know what you're looking at. I think it's a test." Cassa set the report down carefully. "I think someone wanted to know whether we'd notice a small thing before they tried a larger one. And Your Majesty, we very nearly didn't. If your logistics officer hadn't happened to cross-check the manifest against a paper backup out of pure habit, this wouldn't have surfaced in the ministry's reporting for another 2 months, if at all." Vashtor felt something settle into place that had been circling for 11 days without quite landing. Not fear. Something closer to recognition, the particular cold clarity of a hypothesis confirmed. "It's the archive," she said. "They're not inventing new methods. They're going back through their own history and pulling out whatever worked, the way we pulled their history out to study them. They knew we'd study it eventually. They're studying it too. That's a troubling possibility, Your Majesty. It would mean the 6 weeks weren't a surrender at all. It would mean they were reconnaissance, that they let the fleet win, cheaply on purpose, specifically so that they'd have an occupation to work against instead of a war to lose. 6 weeks is exactly enough time to gather intelligence on how we garrison, how we patrol, how we move supply," Vashtor said slowly. "And not nearly enough time for a species with this species' history to have exhausted its will to resist. I don't think they surrendered because they were weak, Minister. I think they surrendered because fighting the fleet directly in the open on our terms was a war they had already priced, and found too expensive for what it would buy them. This isn't that war. This is the one they're actually planning to fight." A young Cothres corporal named Doss, stationed at a checkpoint on the edge of a human settlement the locals called Millbrook, did not read any of the ministry's reports. He would not have understood, if asked, that he was living inside one. What he understood was that the human children who passed his checkpoint every morning on their way to the settlement school had begun, over the course of a few weeks, to greet him by name. It had started small, a nod, a word in halting Dominion trade speech that one of them had clearly practiced. Then it became a routine. A girl of perhaps 10 years, who told him her name was Ruth, would stop at his post most mornings and ask him questions. How old was he? Did his people have schools? Did he miss home? Doss found himself answering. It was easier, somehow, than the silence the checkpoint duty usually required, and his commanding officer had said nothing against it, so he let it continue. He mentioned, once, without thinking much of it, that his patrol rotation had recently changed. that he now worked mornings instead of the overnight watch he'd held since the occupation began, because a new officer preferred younger soldiers on daylight duty. He did not connect this, 3 weeks later, to the overnight watch being quietly and efficiently bypassed by a group that the ministry's investigators would later determine had needed exactly that piece of information, which shift changed, and when to time a raid on a supply cache with no witnesses at all. Nothing had been stolen from Doss's checkpoint. Nothing he had said was, on its own, a secret. He had simply been a friendly, lonely young soldier who liked being asked about his home, and Ruth, or whoever had sent Ruth, had understood exactly what that was worth. When the ministry's investigators finally traced the timing back to Doss's checkpoint and interviewed him, he wept, not from guilt exactly, but from the particular horror of realizing that kindness itself had been the vulnerability, and that nothing about what he'd done would have registered, to him, as carelessness even in hindsight. Casa included his account, unedited, in the report she brought to Vashtor, not to punish him but because it was, in its way, the clearest illustration the ministry had found yet of what they were actually facing. Not spies. Not soldiers. A 10-year-old girl who had, in all likelihood, never held a weapon in her life, deployed with the same patient precision as a scouting drone, by people who understood that an army's weakest point was rarely its walls. Vashtor read the report twice and gave a standing order that no checkpoint duty would be filled by a soldier young enough to be lonely for home. It was a small policy in the scheme of an entire occupied world. She suspected, reading it back to herself, that it would not be enough. But it was the first thing she had done since the surrender that felt like she was finally responding to the war she was actually in, instead of the one she had assumed she'd already won. Over the following weeks, the reports did not stop. They also did not, individually, amount to very much, and that, Vashtor had come to understand, was precisely the design. A shipment misdirected here. A patrol schedule that leaked to a group of humans who shouldn't have had access to it, allowing them to time a supply raid around the exact 15-minute gap between guard rotations. A garrison commander who woke to find his own communications encryption quietly compromised. Not broken so much as borrowed. The intruders careful to leave no trace they'd been inside beyond the data they'd wanted. Threx, to his credit, stopped objecting to the doubled garrisons about the time the third incident crossed his desk. He came to her instead with a different question, one that told her he had finally begun reading the archive himself. My queen, if this is reconnaissance, as the ministry believes, then it is being run with extraordinary patience. No casualties on either side. No demands issued. No manifesto, no declared grievance. Nothing we could negotiate against even if we wanted to. What are they actually trying to accomplish? I asked myself the same question, Vashtor said. I found an answer I didn't like. Read the history of their occupations, Threx. Not the wars, the occupations that followed them. There's a pattern. The resistance that survives longest is never the one that strikes hardest, earliest. It's the one that spends the first year doing exactly what we're seeing now. Learning the occupiers' routines, testing which small transgressions go unnoticed, building a picture of exactly where the seams are, and says nothing, does nothing that could be called an act of war until the picture is complete. And then it stops being small. Threx was quiet for a long moment. You believe we are being studied the way we studied them. I believe, Vashtor said, that we made the mistake of thinking a compliance profile was something we did to them, instead of recognizing it as something they had already, collectively, without any central coordination at all, been doing to every occupier who ever set foot on this world. It's not even conscious anymore, I think. It's simply what this species does. It absorbs the shape of whoever's standing on its neck, and it waits. The confrontation, when it came, was not the one Vashtor had spent weeks preparing for. She had expected, eventually, an incident, a strike against a depot, a garrison overrun, something with enough weight that the ministry's careful pattern of small transgressions would finally tip over into open war, and she would at least know with certainty what she was fighting. Instead, 6 weeks to the day after the compliance profile briefing that had first unsettled her, a single human requested, through entirely legal and formal channels, an audience with the Dominion's Governor-General, and asked specifically to be routed to the Queen herself, on the grounds that what she had to say concerned matters above the governor's authority to resolve. Vashtor granted it, against Threx's strong advice, because she had begun to suspect that refusing to listen to this species was the single most dangerous thing the Dominion could do to itself. The woman who was brought before her was old, Old enough, Vashtor's translator noted, to have been alive during some of the conflicts the Ministry Archive had spent weeks cataloging. She gave her name as Amara Okafor, and her title, when asked, as nothing at all. "I don't represent a government, Your Majesty," she said, through the translator, with a calm that unsettled Vashtor more than hostility would have. "I represent an old habit." "Explain the habit." "When my people are occupied, we don't rise up all at once. We've tried that. It gets a great many of us killed for very little gain. What we do instead is quieter and slower, and it has worked, in one form or another, against every occupier we've ever had, for longer than your dominion has existed." Okafor's expression did not change, but something in her posture suggested she had rehearsed this, had perhaps been chosen to deliver it precisely because she could deliver it without flinching. "We've been doing it to you for 6 weeks. I imagine your ministry has already told you that." Vashtor felt the room go very still around her. Threx's stillness, Cass's, the stillness of officers who had, until this moment, treated the ministry's warnings as an abundance of caution rather than a confirmed and present fact. "Why tell me this?" Vashtor said. "Instead of simply continuing? Because continuing has a cost too, and we'd rather not pay it if there's another way. You've spent 6 weeks doubling garrisons and resecuring your supply lines instead of tightening the terms of occupation, cutting rations, restricting movement, the things every other conqueror in our history did the moment they suspected resistance." Okafor's gaze did not waver. "That tells me you actually read what you found in our archive instead of just filing it. Most of the people who conquered us before you didn't do that. They assumed the surrender meant what it said and found out otherwise the hard way, usually after they'd already made themselves impossible to live under. You haven't done that yet. I'm here to find out whether you intend to." Vashtor did not answer immediately. She had, over the preceding weeks, imagined a dozen versions of a moment like this. A battle, an ultimatum, a negotiation conducted at the point of a weapon, and none of them had looked like an old woman sitting across from her, offering, in effect, a choice disguised as an observation. "What would it look like," Vashtor asked finally, "if I intended otherwise?" "You'd find out. Slowly at first. Then all at once, the way it always goes, and by the time it was all at once it would already be too late to stop cheaply." "That's not a threat, Your Majesty. It's just what the archive you've been reading actually says. If you read it all the way through instead of stopping at the parts that frightened you. And if I intend to hold to the terms my ministry negotiated? To govern rather than merely occupy." For the first time, something shifted in Okafor's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the particular attentiveness of someone recalibrating an estimate. "Then the habit doesn't have anything to do. It's not aimed at you specifically. It's aimed at whoever stands on the neck. If nobody's standing on it, there's nothing for the habit to notice." She paused. "That's rarer than you'd think. Most conquerors can't help themselves. Winning makes them careless, eventually, no matter how carefully they started. I'd like to know if you're the exception before I find out the hard way, the way every generation before mine has had to find out." Vashtor sent Okafor home under guard of honor rather than restraint, and sat alone afterward for a long time, turning over the shape of what had just been offered to her. It was not peace. She understood that clearly enough. It was something closer to a probationary period, indefinite, unwritten, entirely dependent on a habit of restraint that the Dominion across 11 conquered worlds had never once been asked to sustain, because none of those 11 worlds had ever had the patience or the history to make restraint the price of staying alive. She thought of Threx's early confidence, the easy read of a species that surrendered too fast to be dangerous. She thought of how close she had come to sharing it, in the first days after the fleet's cheap and tidy victory, before a ministry analyst's discomfort had sent her down into an archive room alone at the deep end of night cycle. She thought, too, about what it meant that the habit Okafor described was not organized, not centrally commanded, not something a single surrender or a single execution could extinguish. It lived, apparently, in the memory of an entire species, passed down the way some species pass down language or ritual, activated automatically by the specific pressure of an occupier's boot, regardless of who the occupier happened to be. The Dominion had conquered plenty of species who fought back. It had never, as far as its archives recorded, conquered one that remembered how, generation after generation, long after the fighting itself had stopped. She called Casa back in before the ship's lights dimmed for night cycle. "Draft new occupation guidelines," Vashtor said. "Not softer, not weaker, just narrower. I want every garrison commander to understand exactly what constitutes overreach, and I want the penalty for overreach to be as real as the penalty for defiance. If this species only fights the ones who make themselves worth fighting, then the Dominion's entire strategy on this world becomes very simple. Don't become worth fighting." Casa hesitated. "And if some of our own officers can't manage that discipline, Your Majesty?" Threx is not the only one who read the 6-week surrender as weakness. There will be others who think the same, and who won't take kindly to instructions that read, to them, as caution in front of a beaten species. Then I will have learned something about which of my own officers are the actual danger to this occupation," Vashtor said, "because I no longer believe it's the humans." 6 months later, the reports from Earth had gone quiet. Not the loaded, watchful quiet of the first weeks, but something that, cautiously, resembled the ordinary silence of a world getting on with the business of living. No further misdirected shipments. No compromised encryption. Garrison commanders who had grumbled, at first, about the narrower rules of engagement now reported, without being asked, that compliance had become easier the less they pushed. Vashtor did not mistake this for the end of anything. She had read enough of Earth's own history by then to understand that this species measured patience in generations, not seasons, and that the habit Okafor had described did not switch off so much as go dormant, waiting on conditions she had no guarantee of controlling forever. Her own temperament today, some future governor's temper decades from now, an ambitious officer who decided, one day, that the old woman's warning had been bluster after all. What she had gained, in the meantime, was something rarer than a pacified world. A clear, uncomfortable, permanently useful piece of knowledge. Somewhere in the Dominion's long history of conquest, it had learned to measure a species by how hard it fought to keep from losing. It had never learned to measure one by how long it was willing to wait before it decided a fight was worth having at all. Vashtor kept Okafor's transcript in her private files, unabridged, unedited, and had it read, in full, to every governor the Dominion posted to Earth after her. Not as a threat, as an instruction manual for staying alive. The last line of the transcript, the one she made every new governor read twice, was the one that had stayed with her longest. "We're not interested in losing a war we've already priced." She had first taken it in the negotiation records for boilerplate. She understood now that it was the truest thing anyone on that world had told her, and that the wisest thing the Dominion could do, for as long as it wished to keep this planet, was to make certain the price never looked worth paying again. The end.